Let's talk VDML with KJR. Welcome again, everyone, to another episode of Let's Talk VDML, practical conversations about AI assurance. I'm Mike Pedersen and got the pleasure of having Stan and Kelvin with me today, talking about what's happening in AI regulation in Australia. What's some of the current policy? Of course, before we dive in, if you've been finding this content useful, if you want to keep up to date with the sorts of things that we're talking about, then don't forget to like and subscribe or do any of the sorts of things that are appropriate to follow us on whatever platform you're using to consume this content. But without further ado, we've probably seen, Stan and Kelvin, you've been on the podcast before, but we might have new people joining us. So you want to quickly introduce yourselves?
Sure. Yep. I'm Stan. I'm a machine learning and data engineer, but I've been looking a lot at the sort of the compliance, governance, and risk management around all the systems, but from a technical and implementer perspective.
Hi, and I'm Kelvin Ross. I'm CEO of KJR. I came out of the safety critical systems assurance area initially when we started KJR. We've been a software assurance company now for 27 years. Been quite active in the AI space, probably the last 12 years. And again, this topic was something that came up just talking to the safety critical systems community literally last week. So back to the future.
Yeah. So, and there has been a lot of movement in this space in Australia. More broadly, there's been, headlines around AI safety discussions in the UK, in the EU, and in the US already. So, what's the current state of play in sort of AI policy, AI regulation in Australia?
Yeah, I guess if there's a lot of things happened the last few months, both on national level as well on state level. So a lot of states have released their AI policies and several frameworks. But the one we want to focus on today, I think, is the national AI framework, which sort of went into effect the 1st of September this year.
Yep, the policy for the responsible use of AI in government. Yeah, and interesting that sort of followed previous work, didn't it? It's a couple of years ago we had the AI ethics principles came out of the National AI Centre, and then recently all of government in Australia, not just federal government, but all the government agencies signed on to a national framework for around AI assurance, and then shortly after, this policy for responsible use of AI government was issued. So this applies to federal government specifically, but bear in mind that earlier standard has got whole of government, including the states, on board. So it'll be interesting to see. We'll talk about the national federal government policy, but where that follows. It's mandated policy, right? And first of all, before we dive into the policy, who does it apply to? All federal, non-corporate federal government agencies. So, if you're a federal government department or agency, that's non-corporate. So there's many corporate government agencies. It doesn't apply to them if they're more a PTY Ltd government-owned agency. And the other side is it excludes defence and national security. So, anything to do with national level policing, or defence have been excluded as well. So but it's still pretty wide, right? All the federal government agencies. Yeah.
And what that sort of means essentially is that there's now sort of new responsibilities that are being placed on people within those departments, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, exactly. So just to zoom out a little bit even, there's a few things that are mandated, and then there is a whole bunch of recommendations as well. And to your point, one of those things that is mandated is for these departments to have an accountable official, and that's actually coming up soon. That's the 30th of November this year.
It's about 6 weeks away from today.
Yeah, so we're end of October now.
5 weeks,
So that, coming up
Time's
very
running
soon.
out, guys.
That person's going to be accountable, or person, or it could be a chair of body. Important to note as well. So responsibilities can be split across officials or existing roles. So they're a bit loose in how that's formed. But that accountable official is accountable for the implementation of this policy.
Yeah, and as a senior senior responsible officer, they would have to be a public servant, I think, right, in that situation to carry that authority, right? It couldn't be a contractor just contracted in, I'd imagine.
No, it's gonna have to be someone there. Sort of one of the officials. Yeah. I can talk a bit more about what sort of the responsibilities are there. So they'll have to notify the Digital Transformation Agency, which we might shorten into DTA going forward, especially when there is a new high-risk use case identified. Got to be the contact point for the whole of government AI coordination. Has to stay up to date with all the changing requirements, and then also just keep the DTA informed when changes to accountable officials happen.
But the other one is that first one, be accountable for implementation of this policy within our agency. So there's another mandatory requirement, which we'll talk about in a sec, but also the non-mandatory things like the assurance frameworks and other policy that's referred to in the document, right? So really they're responsible for how their agency sort of complies with a bunch of the recommendations and responsibilities coming from this policy area and AI policy.
So stepping back just briefly, we've not really seen anything quite like this within the IT industry before, or are there sort of precedents for having, appointing these, having a policy like this, having a responsible officer?
I think, look, there's probably similarities to like cybersecurity, a bit like your CISO, your Chief Information Security Officer. You look in enterprises, they tend to have a lot of governance around cybersecurity, and then a lot of governance around data governance, right? So there's often some SROs appointed around those roles about how that's managed. So cybersecurity and data privacy and data protection. But I think to your point, it's subtly different now, because now if we go beyond that's management of the assets we've got, but this now is becoming a bit of, well, what's the functionality and the behavior of the IT systems we're building now, and assessing that external risk of how it's used out to its customers and things like that.
Yeah.
And, there's other regulated areas in safety and things like that where there's, SROs responsible for that. But I think that broader IT system governance in terms of assessing, how well, the risk of the application of that IT system on its customers, and, how that risk is assessed and controlled and so on. I don't think we've really seen that level of, outside of the security and very specific domains, that more generally across enterprise systems within government agencies.
Yeah. So there's almost a question in my mind that, like, why now? Is this because AI is fundamentally different, or is it because we've actually had 50 plus years of experience with IT, including lots of big IT failures, and we're seeing an acceleration in technical change in IT? And so what I'm interested in is this a sort of like fundamentally different because AI is fundamentally different, or are we just sort of growing up a little bit and going, you know what, there's lots of potential for IT to, and information technology to create these sorts of problems. So we should, have more control over it. What do you think?
Well, probably a personal take, but I think it's a bit of a combination of both. We've realized that AI comes with a bunch of new challenges, a lot of unknowns, even today, but also looking in the far future. We don't know sort of what capabilities are possible. I think the ChatGPT moment was sort of an eye-opener for a lot of like, oh, hold on, this technology does things we haven't been able to do before. There was also the mass adoption, very fast mass adoption. So we don't really have the time to really see how this all plays out. So maybe let's take a little break and sort of see what we can do at this stage to ensure there are some guardrails in place, just to prepare for the unexpected, I guess. But also we may have had some lessons from our previous technological advancements where we thought it's just another layer of technology. It's still technology, so why do we have to regulate things? I think we see with cybersecurity, etc. These things could have played out a bit differently if there were, I guess, others. If we were thinking about these things a bit earlier as well. But
yeah, I think to add to Stan as well, and we're having those similar discussions, Mark. Yeah, I think there's a bit of a timing around, the AI ChatGPT moment, which is, slightly less than 2 years ago. Like if you think globally, all that change, you had those summits with Rishi Sunak and President Biden signing legislation into place, the formation of AI safety institutes, this view of AI safety, and it's much broader than, say, the safety community looks at risk. It's a much broader sort of societal risk and systemic risk that they're considering there. So there's a lot of hype and uncertainty around that I think is driving into it. Mark, you were chatting about, we've got a rush in Australia and do we start regulating social media and these other things as well? And it's almost, have we sort of lost control and feeling like the genie's out of the bottle a bit? So, are people getting ahead of the game, trying to, make sure the genie doesn't run away before we go too far? But I think the other side is, and we'll come back to the definition of what AI is, which I think is one of the first challenges that we've got to get sorted for this. If you think about their definition, it really is like decision support systems and things like that, which, again, trying to define, well, what is AI? But, you look at some of the decision support system failures. We had robo-debt, which wasn't even robo, it wasn't even AI. Those sort of failures that we've had, which people, put the alarm bells on that this is, a portent of the future sort of thing. So, and I guess the challenge is all this hype, is it overreach? Are we going to go too far and perhaps stifle innovation and the benefit we might get? Or is this risk well-founded?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really good question, right? Because, we are going to dig down in a minute to what is the responsible AI, accountable officer got to account for, and what does that sort of really mean? But I think that is the crux of the challenge. How do we embrace the opportunities that AI brings? And I think on that front, having some regulations, expressing some clarity of this is what we expect, actually helps that innovation, because I think without that, risk-adverse organizations will hold back and go, I'm not going to do it, particularly in public service where people might be sort of like, I don't want to do anything where I stick my neck out, because that's not, typically public service is a risk-adverse, got to be a good custodian of all of those assets. So there's that side of things. So I think it can drive some innovation. But also, I can't help but think about if we don't get some regulation in place, particularly a governing AI that's developed and sort of like put into the market by large vendors, then we run the risk of sort of being a test market. Australia is well known for being a test market. We are avid adopters of technology, but we're sort of sufficiently isolated from other parts of the world that, it's well known. Oh, let's test this new model of this particular thing. And it was interesting hearing Phil Koopmans talking about self-driving cars, Waymo taxis, and some of the investigations that have been conducted into accidents that have happened in that space. And it's interesting to think about how different societies manage risk differently. So in the US, there's often less regulation, but culturally, the US is more litigious. So there's vendors will be, concerned to produce a good product because they don't want to be sued. Whereas Australia, I think we don't have that kind of litigation culture, but we do expect, more government regulation. So I think that's an interesting, and it's almost like each jurisdiction does need to develop its own, here's how we deal with things here, in order to achieve some level of acceptable balance between, risk of things going wrong versus, hey, let's get the good, the benefits out of this technology.
And interesting, that side is like where the legislation's or the policy's heading is, how does it give those guardrails to people to actually move them forward? What we're seeing is fairly open-ended. There's some good recommendations there about frameworks, but it's sort of like going down that risk thing. Oh, well, it's still up to you to find the risk, and where we're seeing a little bit of difference from, say, the EU AI Act, which is a bit more prescriptive about what risk categories sit to. And I've seen this in like the data privacy side, where we've worked with medical data, that sort of Australia sits in this Privacy Act where it's really grey around the de-identification of data. It's really down to a risk assessment and saying, there's, unlikely risk of re-identification. But it's really leaves you in a grey area. If it becomes later re-identifiable, you cross back across. So you kind of like, you're running this sort of gauntlet of trying to get the right fit, where, the US is very prescriptive on that side and says, if you do these rules on the HIPAA compliance, then, okay, you've now got that approval. So it gives real guidance where then people go, oh, I've met those indicated criteria. Obviously we want to operate in a culture of building safe systems, and culture is really important, but I've met that, so I'm not going to be hung out to dry later as the accountable officer, right? It's and the EU, even with GDPR, was, I think, a little bit clearer around what was personal information. So you see that a little bit of a difference.
And it's just tricky, right? It's sort of, I think the intention around having that risk-based approach is maybe to keep the legislation and keep the policy sort of evergreen. So as the technology changes, we keep thinking about what's the actual impact, rather than, being focused just on the use cases that we're aware of right now.
And I think this will be, what does the DTA do now to sort of provide guidance? But again, we see this with so many standards like the FDA. You've got to put your claims and your evidence, but they don't actually tell you what's in the quality management system to do that. But then you find companies sort of follow certain accepted patterns that get, reviewed by the FDA or the TGA and signed off. But the standard doesn't actually tell you what those specific patterns are.
So what is it that, let's unpack just briefly what an accountable officer in that federal government space, there's some AI that might be in use. What do they actually need to do? They need to be appointed. Then they've got to produce a transparency statement by the end of February. What does that really mean?
So what date's that, Stan? It's 28th of February, 2025. So that's the other mandatory requirement of the policy, right? By 28th of February 2025, agencies must make publicly available a statement outlining their approach to AI adoption and use. Must be reviewed and updated annually or sooner. This statement must provide the public relevant information about the agency's use of AI, including compliance on the policy measures, monitor the effectiveness of deployed AI systems and efforts to protect the public. And it's a bit specific where they've gone down into specific things about what that is. So I think this is the first thing, is they basically need to go through the organisation and say, okay, I need to be transparent about AI. The first thing is, well, what are my systems that incorporate AI, right?
It's the inventory. Right? And
so how do they define
that?
Their definition of AI is the OECD statement. I don't want to read it out because you'll get lost. But it's really not that clear that it's anything to do with machine learning or, basically any system for explicit or implicit objectives infers inputs to produce outputs, which may be predictions, content recommendations. And my comment about, isn't that like all IT systems tend to do that? It's an Excel spreadsheet would match that definition. So I think this is the DTA probably will need to clarify this a bit more, right? To give examples of, because if it was, say, an Excel spreadsheet, you go, it is meeting this definition of AI, but that's not really the risk we're talking about here, right? It's and if you think about all the big change that we've seen in the last decade, like AI technologies that we're talking about, it's quite revolutionary as a technology, and it's now how we adopt it. But I kind of feel all the things that the AI safety institutes and this are getting worried about is deep learning, right? And its use of data from a machine learning perspective. And we're really struggling to understand how powerful that is and what exactly is it doing under the hood, right? And that's what you're seeing AI safety institute. So I think the first thing is the inventory will need to give a bit clearer definition, because the accountable officer's got to have a list of, okay, in my organisation, here's the list of things that I think meet the AI definition.
And I guess this, the decision support aspect is probably, certainly within a government setting, this is one of the key things that resonates then also with citizens. How is AI being used in ways that might affect me or affect my rights, is probably the question that's being asked, or the public perception sort of aspect, particularly with the backdrop of, whether, as you say, there was no AI involved in Robodebt, but that sits in the back of people's minds. And, arguably there might be, very little difference, or there's lots of things that would be captured by that current definition. If we did a table join on this database from this department agency and this department agency, we did some data matching.
Well, according to that definition and the OECD definition, which matches it, Robodebt would be an AI solution, right? But in my head, there wasn't machine learning or AI involved here.
Exactly, and you could say that existing frameworks are, should be adequate to actually deal with those kind of use cases. The real question, or the driver behind some of these AI specific policy, is that when you do apply machine learning to these situations, then there is a piece in there where we can't readily explain or account for how that data was matched or why a particular recommendation was made. Whereas if you go back to other more traditionally coded systems, you could find the line of code, you could find the business requirement, you could speak to, if you were diligent enough, to the person who said, oh yeah, this is how this is going to work. Whereas in an AI system, we don't necessarily have that, that clarity of exactly the mechanism that's being used. So for that reason, there's sort of like, potentially heightened risk and a need for more governance.
So that's the first step. So let's say we come up, the agency, develops their approach and hopefully the DTA they will, I expect, put out more clarifying information, give a bit more guidance to people. But yeah, let's assume now we designate, this is now considered an AI system that must be assessed. And so I'd expect, if I was the accountable officer, I'd be building a register of what applications I considered needed to be evaluated for AI. If that's on the list, now what does that person have to do, right? Stan, have you got?
It's a risk assessment mode, I guess. So for each of those sort of systems we've identified for the inventory, I would probably go about sort of seeing in what context is it used. Am I just taking a picture that's auto-focusing? That's probably not going to affect an important decision. But if I'm making certain decisions, and maybe like the robo-debt, but then in this case with AI enabled logic behind it, that's obviously far more impactful to get things wrong there, and having risks of biases and models that aren't fair. So once I've identified those use cases, we can go in risk assessment mode. But the policy actually doesn't give you some recommendations. It gives you a risk matrix to determine the severity of the risks, gives a bunch of examples, but it doesn't really prescribe risks that agencies should be assessing, or the system that's going to be used. So they're sort of saying, yep, use the existing Commonwealth risk management policy, internal agency risk management approaches.
Yeah.
So the question will become, is that going to be sufficient to sort of capture those new challenges?
Essentially, I imagine the expectation is, and this is where it is confusing for people, you have to kind of read this in the context of some other publications like the Voluntary AI Safety Standard and the sort of 10 guardrails that are within that. So if you're trying to do risk assessment, you might be, then going, well, a good way to do risk assessment is to look at what we would like to see and then imagine, well, what if those things fail?
So interesting, you've got those guardrails. Again, they're very broad as well. It's not like the Essential 8, which is a bit specific to security. They really are calling out, I think, the National Framework for the Assurance of Artificial Intelligence Government, which was a document that preceded that. So it's got those 8 AI principles, really close, I think, derived from the AI ethics principles that were put out a couple of years ago. That seems to be the driver for assessing risk. And then, and if you read into that document, then it talks about thinking that in a risk management process. So you're probably starting to head into your ISO 42001, a bit like a AI management process, right? And sort of mapping that out really is a bit like your ISO 9000 or your 27001. What would be that organizational process that you have? So I think from that, you need to develop your risk assessment. So, okay, here's my portfolio of IT systems that include AI, and I've used this as a basis for coming up with the risk. And there's that other standard from the Queensland government, the FAIRA Act, which uses those same principles, but it also looks at, on the other side, let me just look it up. They talk about, on one side, there's components. What are the components that make up the AI system? And then there's the values, which are the AI principles. And it's sort of saying, bring those two together, the way the solution's being built and the way it's being used, with the ethics principles or the assurance principles, and then come up with your risk assessment from that, right? But at the end of the day, like many other systems, your risk assessment will be the supporting bit for each of those AI systems included in scope. I think the downside is there a rapid way of saying, okay, these sort of things we've pre-assessed. Again, we've still got to work out the scope of, say, using Microsoft AI and Microsoft Copilot or something like that, right? And But again, it's not just the system, and a bit like the FARA thing, it's the context, the way the system's used.
How it's
right?
used, yeah.
Yeah, so that use scenario needs to be sort of evaluated. Yeah, so the next deliverable, you know, the EU AI Act sort of just says, okay, there's high, you know, there's unacceptable risk systems, and there's high risk systems, and there's low risk systems. Low risk, more just be transparent about it.
Minimal.
Don't do the unacceptable ones, and the high risk ones. Here's a bunch of things that you should be doing.
Yeah. So you know, I think it's interesting. There's clearly a depth of understanding that's required to be able to carry out this work, right? Like, even even between us, we've been kicking around, well, what actually counts as an AI system? And then being able to develop that asset register with a clear justification for what's in and out, and then doing the work of thinking through, you know, who would potentially be impacted by a particular usage of AI. Where exactly is that data coming from? You know, that might be being used in that AI. Is there any consent or other regulatory, you know, or privacy issues that would apply to that data?
Yeah.
What are the controls? So there's a lot of depth of understanding. Like just getting to the point of publishing a transparency statement says, oh, here's how we're using AI and here's how we're controlling it.
Yeah.
It's actually non-trivial.
And it needs to be specific. It's going to be different depending on the systems you've got, right? Like it's not a one size fits all. And even to that point, yeah, we talked about the risk assessment, but you know, you mentioned one there that's in the list of what you must provide in the transparency statement is, you know, that compliance with applicable legislation and regulation. Kate Conroy in that earlier talk, you know, they're the group that produced the FARA thing, talked about, well, there's 26 different sets of legislation that might apply. So, yeah, so, you know, that producing that information for each of the systems is, I don't think necessarily it's a non-trivial piece of work. And then, okay, you publish this transparency statement. To what level of detail do you provide? Do you provide all the detail behind each of the risk assessments? Or is that some summary information, and, you know, people may have access under freedom of information or whatever to get more specific details. I think at the end of the day, DTA is trying to get a picture of what is being built and considered, which I think is useful, but it'll be interesting how that information then sort of bubbles up to be like a transparency statement that each agency produces.
And I mean, we've talked about this on the podcast before, but obviously, you know, part of the backdrop is that if we don't sort of step in and go, well, here's a good way and a safe way to use these sorts of tools, and we say nothing, the tendency is that people will go and use these tools anyway. Like that is part of the driver, that there's, you know, generative AI has captured the public imagination, including, you know, people who are just trying to get their job done. But we've seen some really, you know, local examples of negative impact where people have gone and used ChatGPT to produce documents for court cases or other, you know, justice applications. There's been some bad headlines around that. Court cases being adjourned, you know, summaries of sensitive data being produced that actually, you know, don't have the right kind of balance, that were sort of minimizing potential harm, that shouldn't have been minimized in that sort of summary. So there's clearly a need to draw out, within each, you know, context of how we're using this technology, particularly in government. Here's how we should be using it. Here's the controls, and to really drive people to grapple with that, rather than allow a proliferation of sort of shadow IT, shadow AI.
What are the acceptable uses? Because it can be one tool, your Microsoft Copilot, but it can be just
Yeah.
used in so many different ways, and most of them might be harmless, but
Yeah.
how do you ensure
And
it's clear?
and also it's what element is. I think, we can't have an element of fear. Oh, because of all this reporting, we'll just stop doing things.
Mm.
I gave a presentation the other night, and someone came up to me at the end saying, "Oh, my daughter was fired from a job because she was experimenting with ChatGPT on work-related stuff, and she was manually de-identifying stuff. So it wasn't like she was doing things, copying out, but she, got through that way." You mentioned the sandpit. Nobody ever mentioned to me that we should be creating sandpits, of safe environments where people can. Because I think until we build literacy within the organisation, not just have a couple of consultants like us who understand this assurance and can come in, but we've actually got to build capability and literacy within the organisation, right? So how do we sort of do this sort of journey together? And I think that's the challenge for the accountable officer, right? There's going to be a lot of them are thrown into this role. They've not worked in an assurance sort of framework before. So those of us who have understand this concept of a risk management framework and governance processes, and so for here we can sort of map it out. Oh, okay, we need to do this assessment, then we need to identify our controls, our testing. Makes sense, but how do we sort of fit that size to the right level depending on the application? We don't want to write this 40-page document for a Microsoft Copilot thing that's in a sandpit, and we want to be rapid there and appropriate, right?
Yeah. So, in some ways, regulation could actually help drive an overall increase in capability in Australia. I mean, I think there's been a lot of concern raised at the AI leadership summit last week around Australia lagging behind in terms of capability, and sort of just positioning itself as a consumer of AI rather than a developer of AI. Part of that has to do with investment. If you look at what's being invested, in other countries, whether it's in, sort of straight up AI data center infrastructure and things like that, or whether it's investment in specific institutions like the AI Safety Institute in Singapore and so forth. There's clearly a focus within those economies to build some capability around AI. So, coming up with a regulatory framework and doing the education piece that's necessary to actually enact that is probably important. Is that going to be enough? What else do we need to be doing, or what are the key takeaways for people who might be listening? How do they get started on this journey, not just in terms of regulation, but also upskilling themselves and making this practical?
Yeah, I think that training piece is going to be very important. Making sure the AI literacy is there in your organization, and then I think it's going to be helpful if you have AI experts to make sure they're dispersed around the organization, so they can sort of almost sit together with other people and sort of bring across some of that technical insights, which drive some of these challenges, which might not be obvious to people who are not doing this on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think exactly what Stan's saying. There's those day-to-day things that we need now. So I think having this risk conversation is really important, and then organisations are better able to access it. So, I mean, we've been involved in big project failures where there's been no assurance framework around it. Massive failure of IT projects and billions of dollars of lost government funding. But there wasn't a change in policy to address that, to actually have an assurance element of are we delivering products right? So this is perhaps a change now, seeing this emerging AI risk, and the work that the AI Safety Institute is starting to look at this thing about, do we agree? Because part of it is as a society and as IT and as business, do we actually understand what the AI risks are that we're trying to control? I think so. Getting better understanding of that, so we can all understand what we're trying to resolve. And then, yeah, do we actually have the sort of methodology and techniques? A big focus of those institutes around test and evaluation, verification, validation. Like, there are big requirements in that transparency about, well, what evaluation have you done that's actually fit for the purpose you're saying you're using it for, right? So how is that done? A lot of people really don't know how to measure that in some of these large foundational models. And so again, as a global society, we're working out that. But the safety institutes also have a much broader outlook as well, of not just saying, okay, this is for accountable organisations what we're doing, but what are the protections that we've got in place for malicious use or things that have more systemic things. And they're bigger problems I think we're dealing with there. But it doesn't matter, like in cyber, it doesn't matter how good a methodology and a governance process we've got if the North Koreans are still publishing misinformation or doing cyber break-ins. What have we done in society to produce various protections for that sort of thing against AI?
So it's going to keep evolving, and I don't think this will be the last time that we have a conversation about what this stuff means. Certainly, I thought it was pretty interesting, some of the conversations that were happening last week at the System Safety Conference, where people are speculating about, well, what does it mean at the point where we start plugging in AI as part of like a automated train protection system or some other safety critical process? How do we reason about that? How do we build a safety case for that? We're sort of in some respects, but at least in rail, as far as I know, probably still a fair way away from doing those sorts of things. But on the other hand, lots of examples of people going, oh, look, maybe we can get it to drive a car, or or whatever, and what does that really look like, or what testing is actually required to get that to work safely. And there's lots of other much more mundane things
I think
to
anybody
consider.
will be putting up those sort of systems from federal government agencies by the 28th of February 2020.
Probably
Definitely
not.
on the high risk angle.
Let's start with here's how we use AI transcription for meeting minutes.
And a bunch of things like that.
But I do find it encouraging that while some people are looking for that really simple low hanging fruit, or just incremental efficiency gains so that you don't have to be doing some tedious work, some of the folks we've been talking to are taking a moment to say, how can we reimagine our business? It's not just about using ChatGPT to spit out more content. That's not necessarily adding a lot of value. But if we can really reimagine how we engage with delivering services, where how do we add more value or keep more value within our community, rather than letting it be bled off into offshore entities. Those sorts of questions are really well worth thinking through. So
how do we make government more engaging, more timely, and more responsive? And those are all good things that we want, right? It's we want to sort of use AI to achieve those positive goals and manage the risk behind the scene, rather than just going, oh, this is all too risky. If we take that approach, we lose the opportunity for our civil society, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So plenty of work to do in this space, and the clock is ticking towards that transparency statement D-Day. So it'll be interesting to see how things evolve over the next 6 months. So look forward to chatting again about all this very soon.
Yep, busy. Thanks, Mark.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.